Have you ever wondered why letting go of responsibility can feel more difficult than taking it on? Have you ever sensed that God was asking you to trust someone else with an important task, yet something deep within you resisted the idea? Delegation is often presented as a leadership skill, but beneath the surface, it is also a spiritual journey. It asks us to trust, to discern, and sometimes to surrender our desire for control. Today, we will explore how spiritual discernment helps us recognize when to step forward and when to step back, and when to trust God's work through others. Welcome to the Listening Heart, folks. At its core, leadership integrates how we think, act, and live across business, work, and life. And from a scriptural and values-driven perspective, spiritual leadership is the practice of leading from within, guided by wisdom, faith, and values, and a higher purpose. On Wednesdays, our discussions turn to the Coaching Talk series, which focuses on performance leadership in the traditional workplace. And on Fridays, we turn to adaptive leadership in the digital world. Now, what gives me the right to talk about all these things? Well, it really follows my life experiences, folks. From 6 years in the seminary under the guidance of Benedictine monks, to 18 years in government at the executive level, to owning my own consulting and training business for over 45 years, and finally, to transitioning my work into the digital world over the past several years. Now, although this podcast focuses on spiritual leadership, we're called to lead in some way, no matter what our purpose is in life. And today, we'll explore spiritual discernment in daily life and trusting God's lead when delegating. I'm Richard Fontanie, and I'll be your host today, folks. And if you're new to this podcast, welcome. And if you're returning, a heartfelt welcome back. And before we begin, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And thank you for doing so. Now, this week's focus is on delegation and empowerment. It means trusting with others with responsibility while entrusting God with the outcome. Now, that sounds simple, but many of us find it easier to talk about trust than actually to practice it. The question before us is not merely whether we can delegate, because we can do that. The deeper question is whether we can discern God's invitation to empower others while remaining faithful to our own calling and our own responsibilities. Now, one of the greatest challenges in delegation is not deciding what to delegate. The real challenge is deciding whether we trust enough to let it go. Many leaders and parents and business owners, volunteers, and community members carry responsibilities because they believe no one else can perform them as effectively as they can. While experience and competence matter, spiritual discernment invites us to look deeper. It asks whether our reluctance stems from wisdom or from fear. Now, the Old Testament offers an important example, and that example is exemplified through Moses. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses tried to shoulder the leadership burden of an entire nation. And day after day, he listened to disputes and rendered judgments. And his father-in-law, Jethro, observed the situation and offered practical wisdom. He advised Moses to appoint capable individuals to share responsibility and serve the people. And Jethro recognized that Moses was becoming exhausted and that the people were being poorly served by a system dependent on a single individual. Now, what is remarkable is that Moses listened. He did not defend his position or insist that he could perform the task correctly. Instead, he recognized the wisdom in the counsel he received and adjusted his leadership approach. Now, that lesson remains relevant today. Spiritual discernment often comes through prayer, reflection, scripture, and wise counsel. It requires humility, and sometimes God's direction comes through unexpected people and conversations. Trusting God's lead when delegating does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means recognizing that God often works through others. Leadership becomes healthier when responsibility is shared, gifts are developed, and opportunities for growth extend beyond ourselves. Discernment begins when trust outweighs fear. The New Testament offers perhaps the clearest model of delegation and empowerment in the ministry of Jesus. Now, as we read the gospel accounts, we see that Jesus did not attempt to accomplish his mission alone. He intentionally gathered disciples, taught and mentored them, challenged and corrected them, and eventually entrusted them with meaningful responsibilities. Now, this pattern is significant. Jesus possessed the authority, the wisdom, and the ability to accomplish every task himself. Yet, he chose a different path. He invested in people. He empowered others to participate in the work. He created opportunities for growth through experience, rather than through observation alone. Consider how Jesus sent his disciples into communities to teach, to serve, and to minister. They did not always succeed. At times, they misunderstood his teachings. At times, they lacked confidence. At times, they made mistakes. Yet Jesus continued to guide, encourage, and develop them. Now, this example offers an important lesson for spiritual leadership. Effective delegation is not merely about completing tasks. It's about developing people. When leaders focus only on immediate results, they often retain too much responsibility. When leaders focus on long-term growth, they create opportunities for others to learn and to contribute. In our own lives, we are often tempted to judge delegation solely by short-term performance. Spiritual discernment, on the other hand, encourages a broader perspective, prompting us to ask different questions. Who might grow through this opportunity? What gifts could emerge if this responsibility were shared? And how might God be preparing someone through this experience? Jesus demonstrated that leadership multiplication is more powerful than leadership accumulation. Empowering others is not a distraction from leadership. It is one of leadership's most important responsibilities and a lasting contribution to future growth. If spiritual discernment is essential to effective delegation, then how do we put it into practice? Well, let me suggest 5 simple approaches to guide us. First, begin with prayer. Now, before assigning responsibility, take time to seek wisdom and clarity. Ask God to help you recognize both the opportunity and the person best suited for it. Second, pay attention to gifts and strengths. Scripture reminds us that people have different talents and abilities. Delegation is more effective when responsibilities align with those gifts. Third, communicate expectations clearly. Trust and clarity are partners and not competitors. People need to understand outcomes, responsibilities, timelines, and the support that is available. Fourth, remain available without being controlling. Now, one of the most difficult balances in leadership is providing guidance while allowing others sufficient freedom to learn. Healthy delegation requires support without micromanaging. And finally, the 5th is practice grace. Every learning experience involves mistakes. Growth often emerges from trial, reflection, adjustment, and renewed effort. Now, these practices help create environments where people feel both supported and empowered. They also help leaders avoid common delegation mistakes, such as withholding responsibility, or moving on too quickly, or expecting perfection. And most importantly, these practices encourages us to view delegation through a spiritual lens. Instead of asking only how a task will be completed, we begin asking how people might grow through the process. We begin to see opportunities for development, confidence, and service. Delegation then becomes more than a management technique. It becomes a way to participate in God's work of developing people and strengthening communities. That perspective transforms both the leader and those being led in meaningful and lasting ways. Spiritual discernment in delegation applies to our everyday life. Consider a parent teaching a child's responsibility. Now, it may take longer at first, and mistakes will happen, but growth becomes possible when responsibility is shared. Consider a manager developing a future leader by assigning a challenging project. Now, the assignment may involve risk, yet it also creates a tremendous amount of opportunities. Consider a church volunteer mentoring someone new rather than carrying every responsibility alone. New gifts emerge when space is created for others to contribute. Now, the common thread across each example is trust. Leaders who trust wisely create opportunities for development. Leaders who refuse to let go often become overwhelmed and unintentionally limit others' growth. Now, as you reflect this week, consider these few questions. Where might God invite you to release control? Are you holding onto a responsibility too tightly? Is there someone who would benefit from more trust and encouragement? And are you creating opportunities for others to develop their gifts and their abilities? Spiritual discernment invites us to listen carefully, pray thoughtfully, and act courageously. It encourages us to see delegation not as losing control, but as expanding influence through service, trust, and empowerment. Often the greatest gift we can give another person is the opportunity to grow through meaningful responsibility. Now, as we conclude today's conversation, remember that spiritual leadership is not about shouldering every burden alone. It's about discerning where God calls us to serve and where God invites us to empower others. A delegation rooted in prayer, wisdom, and trust builds stronger people, healthier communities, and more sustainable leadership. Now take a moment this week to reflect, pray, and realign with your heart. And if this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and share with a friend. And thank you for doing so. Together, let us continue growing as leaders who trust God and develop others. Oh, and there's just one more thing, the learning lens. Now, I've added this to the end of each podcast, and it's designed to further your learning and follows my perception of this conversation. Today's insight could be trusting God's lead in delegation as it develops both leaders and followers. What worked well? Scripture connected naturally to practical leadership. Here's a further point to consider. Where might fear be limiting trust for you? And here's a question. Who can you empower this week? And finally, what is the takeaway for today? From my perception, it's delegation is an act of faith that multiplies growth. I'm Richard Fontanie, signing off. Stay tuned for next week on The Listening Heart when we turn our attention to God's perspective on success, redefining what it means for achievement. I hope to see you then. Bye for now.